really quick lecture to help some people from my 101 class out to have a little more review for the test. We're going to talk about kind of our section on epistemology, at least from Descartes to Berkeley. Okay, and to begin this discussion, the first thing we need to talk about is the main paradigm that all these thinkers are kind of working under. Descartes is going to be the one who really introduces it as we know it, and the rest of the thinkers that come after there are going to kind of play with it, all right, and kind of mess around with this idea. The basic idea that they're all going to follow to some extent is what we call, or what can be called, the representational theory of perception. And why I wrote it with a hyphen in there, you'll see in 1 second. Okay? So the basic idea is this. By the time we get to the 1500s, 1600s, what's going on is the idea of the soul, okay, that has been kind of here since the Greeks, okay, and also the Christians as well believe in it. There's the soul within the body. The idea of the soul is becoming now to take on the idea of what a mind is, okay? Now, no one's proven it yet, but people are starting to figure out perhaps the mind is right here in the brain, okay? And what the representational theory of perception is this, is that the mind exists within the body, okay? And so we use that to represent our mind. But our mind is immaterial, okay? Just like the soul was. The mind is something immaterial. It's the thing that makes us who we are. As we'll see, Descartes considers it that, all right? It's the thing that's within us that controls the body, all those things. But the body is part of the outside world, the physical world. So really what we see the representational theory of perception is separating the world into two things. Immateriality, which is our mind, and then our body and the physical world is the other part, okay? Now, basically this is how the representational theory of perception works. How do we perceive? That's what it's about. So let's say in the external world, there is a box in front of me. What happens according to this theory is, let's say in this case, it's my eyes as a sensory apparatus that I'm using, goes through my eyes, goes into the brain, which is part of the body, and then it gets represented, the thing I'm observing, in the mind, okay? So what is happening here is I'm representing it in my mind, okay? Now, the point is the box or whatever I'm looking at doesn't physically get into my mind, it couldn't. So what am I seeing actually is actually my representation, my mental representation of what the thing is, okay? That's why, of course, according to many of these theories, why we can be confused, why two people can look at the same thing but see something different, is because of their representation. Their mind is representing it separately, okay? We may be talking about the same thing, but the representation of it could be different, okay? And this accounts for whether you touch it, you taste it, whatever it is, okay? All those are sensory apparatuses, the five senses. They all get represented in the mind, okay? Now, what eventually happens is the skeptic comes along, okay, and begins to doubt this, and there's one really big question. How do I know that what's in here is actually out there? How do I know that what my mind is representing is actually what's outside of me? Okay? And this is a really tough question. Well, there's many things you can say, well, not just use my sight, use my touch, my taste, all those things, but like I said, those are also as well part of representation. Any touch or taste or anything I use else or hearing all goes through a representation, okay? Or we could say, what if someone else comes along and goes, hey, I see a box, okay? Or square, right? Well, that would be nice because we're both saying, hey, there's a box there, I'm saying there's a box there must be a box. But the problem is, and from my perspective, this is also happening in with my representation, and here you are talking about the box, okay? So what I'm actually observing is actually my mind. The only way, the skeptic says, let's kind of erase this part here, the only way we could ever know that what's in here is actually out here is if we could get to some type of third position, okay, some position outside my mind and outside of the external world in which I could see both. Here's my mind, here's the external world, and then compare the two, and then see if they correspond to each other, okay, which is kind of a truth of correspondence idea, right? The problem is, you can't get outside your mind. Anywhere you go, I'm over here or over there or over wherever, my mind seems to go. Only time I can escape my mind is if I was non-existent, okay? And so this is the problem. They seem to say that I can never know what is actually going on in my mind. It corresponds with what's outside myself. Therefore, knowledge is impossible, okay? Knowledge of how things really are is impossible. And this is the main kind of dilemma and paradigm that's going to be worked on by Descartes, Locke, Berkeley, and David Hume as well, even though we're not going to talk about Hume in this section, okay? So how does it get here? Now, what Descartes sees himself doing is trying to defend this idea and show that knowledge is still possible. But what he's going to do is actually take this skeptical idea and say, okay, maybe the skeptic is right. Let's doubt everything that's possible to doubt. okay? Anything that can. And he goes to doubting the physical world, which we've seen is definitely doubted by this idea, that could he be sure that the world is actually appearing, the way the world appears to him is actually how the world is? He can't be sure about that. And so if he's not sure, you throw it out. Only things that are certain can count as knowledge. He even gets down to even throwing out some a priori truths, truths that you know just by thinking, rational truths, despite Descartes being a rationalist, okay? Things like in mathematics, he says he doesn't see how they could, but perhaps some way he could have been deceived and they're not really that way, such as maybe there's an evil genius controlling me or something, I don't know, okay? But he gets down to there is at least one thing that the skeptic cannot doubt, and this becomes his basis for truth. And that basis is this: it cannot doubt that I think. Okay? One cannot doubt, or at least Descartes cannot doubt that he thinks. And if you do the same thing, you cannot doubt, according to him, that you think. The basic idea is this, is I can doubt everything, but can I doubt the act of thinking? And of course, the actual act of thinking requires doubting. I mean, go ahead and try it. Try right now to doubt that you're thinking. Okay, and what happens here is you obviously think. And this is his first truth. He goes, here is something that cannot be doubted. Something that even the skeptic cannot doubt. Even if I'm dreaming, even if I'm in the Matrix, or even if I'm in the world of the evil genius, I can still not doubt that I think. They cannot take that away from me. Okay, I think is the first thing. Now, of course, Descartes goes on to say, there's another truth that goes along with this. Because if I'm thinking, the thinking thing must necessarily then exist. If you think, there must be something which exists that does think. So I think, therefore, I am. Okay? Maybe we could think of it better as thinking, therefore I am. All right? This becomes his kind of foundation, and this what kind of sets up the whole representational theory of perception, which is basically what we're talking about now. Is by saying I think, therefore I am, he is now guaranteed that at least we know I exist, or that, as we'll see, the mind exists. Okay? That we know that the mind exists. I cannot know maybe what's outside of that or anything, but at least I know here I am, no matter what's going on. And so these are the first kind of two truths, but there's a third truth that he mentions, and will become quite big with these empiricists here. And that third truth is that we can trust our appearances. And what basically that means is the contents of our mind. Okay? That you were correct, skeptic, he would say. I cannot maybe know for sure that there's actually a table or a box or a trash can here in front of me. Okay? But I can at least know the way in which my mind represents it. That right now in my mind, there seems to be a trash can, or seems to be a table, or seems to be a box, or a camera here in front of me. Okay? Now I can't be sure if there really exists in the actual physical world, external world, but I can at least be sure that in my mind, I know exactly what I'm seeing, and that is a camera or a table or whatever in front of me. And so not only do I think, therefore I exist, I am, I also can be sure of my appearances. They cannot be doubted, the way the world appears to me. It might not match up with the actual world, but at least I can know my own mind. And this is what I was trying to point out, is what sets the basis of this idea right here. Is by saying that I can know this, but maybe I can't know outside of it, but at least for sure I have this. And that is where we'll see the empiricists really pick up on and are really influenced quite a bit by Descartes. Not as many French are influenced by Descartes as I would say the English, or excuse me, the British empiricists, okay? Now, just real quick before I go on the Locke, I want to mention, go back to this, why I use represent, okay? And that's really what's happening here, is the external world is here, and what my mind is doing is representing this idea to me, okay? That's how it kind of looks. That's the word, the way Descartes is looking at it, okay? I didn't mention that first, but I should go back and say that. All right, now where's John Locke come into this? Well, John Locke is the beginning of what we call British empiricism, and really the start of what I like to call radical empiricism. Even though he doesn't go quite that far yet, he's the beginning of this idea of radical empiricism. Now, Locke didn't really buy this whole skeptical objection that you couldn't know the physical world. He really was a good Englishman, and he always believed that it was foolish to think the actual world doesn't exist. For example, when I start a fire in my cabin and I leave for an hour and come back, the cabin is warm. It seems like the actual, the world doesn't depend on my mind. There's things that are in the world. I don't have to be there for it to work, okay? So he didn't buy that, right? But he begins to set the stage of people who would completely deny the physical world, okay? And so what John Locke decides to do is he wants to figure out a way in which he understands that sometimes we get things wrong. He is an empiricist, so therefore he thinks only experience and observation is what counts. But what he does is breaks it up into two types of observations. He says there are primary substances that we can observe, substances, and then there are secondary. Okay? Now what are these things? Primary substances are the actual things that are in the external world itself, the world itself, and basically are geometrical realities, okay? Size, shape, and texture, right? Shape, texture here, okay? Geometric space is what he seems to be talking about, extension, all right? Then there are the secondary substances, and these are what he would call the mind-dependent substances. These are mind-independent, primary. Secondary are mind-dependent. Therefore, they are the things the mind gives to the actual primary substances. And these include basically everything in our sensations, such as color, okay, taste, okay, the feel of something, the smell, all right, how something sounds, okay. I put that one in parentheses. It's how it sounds good, bad, these type of things. He says this is what goes on. Now, there are primary substances that we all encounter, according to him, okay, such as an apple, the extension, the size, shape, and texture, the extension of the apple here. But there are secondary substances when I eat it that come into play, such as the taste, okay? That's why one person can taste the same apple, it tastes bitter, while the other person tastes it, it tastes sweet. It's because the mind is adding these substances to the original substances, okay? And so what Locke is really maintaining is a really original sense of the representational theory of perception. There is the mind, which controls some things, but then there is definitely the external world in which the mind can affect. Okay, and this he can explain hallucinations, problems in observation, all while maintaining a actual mind world and actual external world as well. Okay. Now, what eventually happens is George Berkeley comes along and begins critiquing Locke's idea. And George Berkeley, I would say, is definitely by this time a radical empiricist. Okay. What he wants to say is, well, if you really want to be skeptical about this, you're right, secondary substances can change. Color, taste, feel, smell, sounds, all those things, depending on who I am and what I'm feeling like that day, maybe they will change. But he also wants to point out that these things, primary substances, seem to be able to change as well, such as the size and shape and texture, depending on how you look at it and the angle you look at it from, do change also. He talks about a famous idea of like her. Famous kind of experiment of taking your finger and pressing it in the corner of your eye and looking at solid objects. What happens is they end up splitting up or becoming two or something like this. What he's showing is that primary substances could be just as mind-dependent as the secondary substances, and therefore they are all one substance, a mind substance. Okay, and what Berkeley does is become very radical. He's an empiricist still, but what he does is says there is only one thing that exists, and that is the mind. Okay, there is no external world. And so when we ask what we are observing in Berkeley's view of the world, is what we are observing actually the contents of our mind, nothing more. And the thing is, there isn't anything outside the mind. So really, what we have now is we are always ready to understand what the world is, because all we have is our mind. And Descartes has shown we can always trust what's in our mind. All right? He's shown that the appearances are always correct. We know how things seem to be to me. And so what he sets up now is creates this idea that there is only the mind. There is no external world. Basically, we are mental substances, nothing more, nothing outside of it. And therefore, the knowledge that we need to know can be right here in front of us. Okay? His famous statement, to be is to be perceived. Okay? Is what he claims. To exist is to be a perception. If you are not perceived, you do not exist. Okay? This is quite a radical idea, and as I say, it's really now where empiricism gets radicalized itself. Okay? What we are observing now is not external realities, but realities of the mind, and that's all that exists. Okay? But there are some major problems that come up here, and I want to kind of show you what Berkeley does to get around them. First one, if to be is to be perceived, is what we're saying. That means if I'm not perceiving something, then that something doesn't exist, which seems to be quite correct on this theory. That means right now the hallway that's out of here, if me or no one else is perceiving it, it doesn't exist. But now as I turn and look out the door, it does. And now as I come back, it doesn't. Okay? That seems strange. It seems to go against common sense that no, this thing out there exists without me. Okay? But according to this, it would not. This is what we call the kind of the tree falls in the woods problem, right? For Berkeley, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, the answer to that is no, but actually there is no tree or forest because there's no one to perceive anything. So therefore, that forest didn't even exist. Okay? Sounds strange, right? Another basic problem for Berkeley is what we call the problem of solipsism, which the idea of solipsism is that if there is a mind, there's only one mind, and that mind is mine. Okay? That's the one I can know. It's my mind, and all others who exist in my reality are only figments of my own mind. We say figments of imagination, figments of my mind. Therefore, they don't have minds. I might assume they do, but they really don't. There only exists one mind. It's mine. And the statement of one of my friends is he likes to say, this is my world, you're just living in it. Okay? That is, on Berkeley's terms, would be true. So you have the problem of solipsism as well. Another big problem Berkeley countered was, well, if the perceptions, they are definitely there. For Berkeley, he said, well, where do they come from? If there's no outside, how do I get these perceptions when I look at things? So also where they come from. Those, we'll see, David Hume doesn't think that's a problem. Berkeley did think it was a problem. Where do they come from? So we have three kind of objections Berkeley really needs to deal with. What happens to things that aren't perceived? Okay. Second, what about solipsism? And third, finally, where do the perceptions come from in the first place? And he has a very kind of brilliant idea. Some may call it a cop-out, but how he looks at it is kind of brilliant. And he says, well, he brings in one idea that saves the day, and he brings in the idea of God. Okay? And he claims that God is the ultimate mind, the most perfect of all minds, and perceives everything. We exist in the mind of God. Therefore, if we do this and exist in the mind of God, what happens is all these problems disappear. Well, what about the things that we aren't perceiving? Who's perceiving them now? Well, God is perceiving them because he is perfect perception, perceives all at all times. Now we look at the problem of solipsism. If there's only in my mind, or if there's only one mind, it's mine. Okay? What do we do about all these other people we assume have minds? Well, if we all exist in the mind of God, now they can have their independent minds along with me, all within moving in this realm of God. And then finally, where do our perceptions come from? God puts them there. And so what we're getting is kind of a God world, a mental God world in which if we are all these little circles, all our minds are within the mind of God. Okay? Now, Berkeley thinks that actually his work, as you see, is a proof of the existence of God. Because he thinks by what has been happening here is proven. If reason has shown to be true, and reason, he believes, has shown that there is only the mind, nothing outside of it. Okay? But by taking that and thinking that's right, he gets left with these problems. And he says, well, there are these problems that arise out of this correct reasoning. Okay? There must be an answer to this reasoning, which is almost a very rationalistic kind of approach. There's these holes that kind of show up, and what our reasoning is, and the only thing that he thinks he could fill it with to solve the dilemma is bringing God into it. So he actually thinks his work is in some way a proof of the existence of God as well. Now, as a critique, just to be quick, you're right, that would solve the problem. But also, if you look at it, wouldn't assuming an external world, a physical world, exist independently of us also solve this problem? Okay, it would, all right? And really, if I want to take this little circle here and say, well, this is now external world, the outside one, and all these are all of us within it, the same, it looks almost the exact same, okay? Now, a lot of people get on Berkeley for this, but it's still a very interesting move. Now, this is basically a very short history of what happens from Descartes up to Berkeley. David Hume is really going to break everything open, and who I really kind of take on as being the quintessential radical empiricist, and really I think takes all this and puts it in a new way. Really to take the modern world of philosophy and kind of getting it ready for what we call our contemporary world. But that is for another time. If you have any questions, please email me, and I'll see you next time on Professor Castleberry's Philosophical Lecture Course. Thank you very much.